Hi, Mystery Recap here. Today I'm going to explain a horror drama movie called Dumplings. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The movie begins at the China border, where a young woman named Mai walks through a security checkpoint, carrying a colorful lunchbox. She later reaches her home in Hong Kong and carefully unpacks the box. Most of the food is discarded, but she keeps one small item, an orange pulp-like a substance. She rinses it in a bowl of water and eats it raw like an animal. The next morning, a former TV actress, Mrs. Lee, arrives in the neighborhood, searching for Mai's house. After wandering through the narrow streets, she finally finds it and is welcomed inside. As they sit down, Mai playfully asks her guest to guess her age. Mr. Lee stares at her for a while and guesses she must be around 30. But Mai laughs at the answer and reveals that she's much older, so old that everyone around calls her at. Following this, we finally get to know the reason for her visit. Once a celebrated star, Mrs. Lee's beauty was her greatest asset and her husband was devoted to her. But now, the years are catching up, and she's terrified of losing both her looks and her husband's affection. Mrs. Lee learned through her sources that Aunt Mai's dumplings work better than any other cosmetics to make one look younger. She thus wants to try them in hopes of keeping her rich husband, Mr. Lee, close to her. Soon, Mai enters her kitchen to prepare the dumplings. She explains that her secret ingredient doesn't just improve appearance as it stops itching from within. Mai then uses all her expertise to craft the dumplings with special care. Once they're ready, she serves them to her guest, urging her to eat it while they're warm. But as soon as Mrs. Lee takes the first bite, there's an awkward pause. This is because the taste isn't good and one dumpling even spills to the floor. But a calm Mai picks it up and reassures her guest, urging her to focus on the results. She claims that her dumplings provide the rejuvenation that no other expensive cosmetic can ever provide. Encouraged by her words, Mrs. Lee closes her eyes and begins devouring the dumplings. The scene shifts to Mr. Lee, who is swimming in a pool, laughing and flirting with the woman around him. After his swim, he sits by the pool and gets a massage from a young woman. His behavior turns inappropriate as he starts touching her and making suggestive comments. At one point, he cracks open an egg and eats something unusual from inside it. Mrs. Lee watches everything go down from her window. She is clearly troubled by her husband's actions and what it means for their relationship. Later, Mai visits a hospital and meets with a doctor. The latter hands her a box but tells her she can't keep providing the ingredient like before. Mai is slightly annoyed by this but doesn't say a word and quietly leaves. The next day, Mrs. Lee visits Mai again for more dumplings. During their conversation, she asks what the secret ingredient is, to which Mai casually explains that she uses fetus meat. Mrs. Lee takes this as an obvious joke and doesn't ask any further questions. Shortly after, the dumplings are prepared and Mrs. Lee eats them with much delight. The scene abruptly changes and we see Mr. Lee being intimate with a young masseuse in a hotel. He seems to be greatly enjoying his time and he suddenly receives a call from his wife, Mrs. Lee. The disgruntled husband makes up a lie and tells her that he is currently busy in an important meeting. Later when he returns back home, Mrs. Lee tries to catch his attention. She suggests that they should spend some time together on the occasion of their 15th anniversary. But her husband seems to have different plans and says he needs to leave for yet another important business trip. It is not as if Mrs. Lee doesn't know what these business trips are about, but she is unable to do anything as her husband hands her a check for a huge amount and asks her to enjoy herself. If things continue to go the same way, she will lose her husband and the luxurious life that comes with him. An increasingly desperate Mrs. Lee now starts to visit Mai more frequently. The same dumplings that she used to find quite weird, she now eats them casually. Mrs. Lee even starts giving out culinary tips to make these dumplings more palatable. Several days pass by and Mai begins to notice a lot of changes in her client. Mrs. Lee's skin looks youthfully supple and the wrinkles around her eyes also seem to be vanishing. However, an extremely impatient Mrs. Lee cannot wait for several months as she fears she will lose her husband by that time. She begs Mai to do something radical that will give her big changes in a short amount of time. Mai tells her to keep eating the dumplings but promises to come up with some alternative method. Sometime later, just after Mrs. Lee leaves the apartment, a middle-aged woman arrives along with her young daughter, Kate. The mother has heard up that Ma used to be one of the best gynecologists in China and wants her to help Kate. It is then revealed that the young girl is currently 5 months pregnant, but her mother cannot afford the treatment in any hospital. We also learned that Kate was impregnated by her own father, which is why her mother is hell-bent on aborting the kid. However, Ma refuses to do as Kate is too young and the fetus is already 5 months old. She instead directs them to an illegal clinic where psycho procedures are carried out. Ma is also associated with the hospital, but not as a gynecologist or in any professional capacity. She actually takes preborn fetuses from the clinic and infuses their flesh in her dumplings. This is her secret ingredient, the magic behind her everlasting youth. On the other hand, Mrs. Lee tracks down the hotel where her husband is staying during his busyness trip. She quickly realizes that he is having an affair with a masseuse. This younger and better looking woman comes to his room every night and hangs up the do not disturb sign on the door. Heartbroken by her husband's betrayal, Mrs. Lee takes Ma to her house where the two have a heart-to-heart conversation. They talk about their respective married lives and Mrs. Lee finally opens up. She reveals that she wants to start a family, but for some reason she can't seem to conceive. Furthermore, her husband has been seeing someone younger and better looking than her. Mrs. Lee again begs Ma to come up with some solution that could bring back her youth overnight. On the other hand, Kate's condition is also worsening with each passing day. She is now visibly pregnant and her mother visits Ma daily, begging her to help them. The very next day, Ma finally performs the risky procedure in her own apartment. She doesn't use any anesthetics during the surgery and successfully brings the fetus out. This causes Kate a lot of physical trauma, but Ma now has a pure fetus, untouched by any chemicals. All of the other ones that she used in her dumplings were at max a month old. She hopes that this 5-month, untouched Onia will be the ingredient that exponentially increases the effects of her dumplings. The next day, Mrs. Lee visits Ma. Mo promises to provide her with dumplings which will make her look much younger in a short few hours. Ma then enters the kitchen and takes out the 5-month-old fetus. As she's busy grinding up the flesh, Mrs. Lee decides to take a peek. The poor woman is horrified when she realizes that Ma was not lying about the fetus meat. This prompts her to immediately run away from the apartment. However, once she reaches the streets, Mrs. Lee starts to think about the consequences. Her beauty and youth are the only things that are holding her marriage together. She cannot afford to lose her husband and the luxurious life that comes with him. Hence, she returns to the apartment where she watches Ma prepare the dumplings and later eats them with great interest. A few hours later, Mrs. Lee begins to see the changes in her body. She now feels more enthusiastic and has a spring in her steps. Things get even better when she returns home and Mr. Lee compliments her beauty. After a long time, the husband and wife make love to each other that night. Elsewhere, young Kate and her mother are traveling to their home on a bus. Kate is bleeding profusely because of the impractical abortion performed on her. She loses so much blood that she soon loses consciousness and collapses on the road. Unfortunately, she ends up dying in her mother's arms, devastating her. On the other hand, Mrs. Lee hosts a party for her friends, trying to flaunt her new gained beauty. She quickly gets this validation as everyone is in awe of her youthful appearance. However, things start going downhill when her friends complain about some awful fish-like smell coming from her. Mrs. Lee is so embarrassed that she quickly rushes to the bathroom and locks herself in. She calls Ma and angrily inquires what kind of fetus was put inside the latest dumplings. She also threatens to inform the police if Ma doesn't quickly solve this problem. Unbeknownst to her, Mr. Lee has been eavesdropping on this conversation the whole time. Back on the phone, Ma reveals that she had used the fetus that was conceived through incest and assures her that the side effects will go away soon. Mrs. Lee is still incensed, but she has no choice but to wait, so she starts watching her old TV episodes. Later that night, Mr. Lee pays a visit to Maya and inquires about her illegal business. She tells him that it's just a dumpling shop and asks him to get comfortable inside. She then starts preparing the dumplings while explaining to Mr. Lee about the merits of cannibalism and how it was celebrated in the past. She goes on to mention that people used to survive famines by eating their relatives. Human flesh was also used to cure various diseases, and even the soldiers used to celebrate their victory with the enemy's blood and meat. After Mai finishes cooking the dumplings, she serves it to Mr. Lee. He starts eating it without any hesitation and even seems to be interested in her. Mai notices these and begins to seduce the old businessman. She reveals that she is in fact 60 years old and looks so young because of her dumplings. Shortly after Mr. Lee finishes eating the dumplings, he grabs Mai and the two make love. Their session is briefly interrupted by a call from Mrs. Lee. Mo desperately asks Mai for more dumplings. However, the latter ignores these pleas and goes back to making love with her newest client. The next day, Mrs. Lee visits a hospital and explains about her bad odor problem, but the doctor simply advises her to remain indoors and consume nutritious foods. Just as Mrs. Lee is about to return home, she spots the young masseuse with whom her husband used to spend a lot of time. Mrs. Lee tails the woman and soon realizes that she is pregnant with her husband's child. Afraid of her relationship's future, Mrs. Lee starts roaming around the streets, sobbing uncontrollably. Shortly afterwards, she finds Mai in Sadia hair salon and begs her to provide her with the dumplings. Mrs. Lee also assures her that money is not an issue and hands her a huge check. However, Mai ignores her and coldly says that there are no more dumplings. Mrs. Lee is stunned by this sudden change in behavior and storms out of the salon. Seconds after she departs, Mr. Lee calls Mai and asks to meet her privately. The scene shifts and we see two police officers hurrying towards Kate's apartment. They find her mother holding a knife that is covered in blood. It is revealed that the woman has stabbed her husband to death for what he did to their daughter. This horrible news soon reaches Mai, who immediately leaves her apartment with all her belongings. When Mrs. Lee visits Mai's apartment later, she finds it being raided by the police. Following this, Mrs. Lee heads back to the hospital where she tracks down the young masseuse. The latter reveals that she is 5 months pregnant and Mr. Lee is promised to pay a handsome amount if she delivers him a healthy baby. Mrs. Lee is surprisingly happy at the news and mentions that she wants the baby to be aborted. In return, she is willing to pay double the amount that her husband has promised. The masseuse agrees to the offer right away and we see Mrs. Lee asking the doctor not to use any drugs while performing the abortion. Is now obvious that she wants to create her own dumplings so that she can preserve her beauty. The movie comes to a close as Mai cautiously walks on the streets with her belongings while Mrs. Lee chops up the fetus to prepare the dumplings for herself. Generated with https://com.i
देखा हजारों दफा आपको फिर बेकरारी कैसी है संभाले संभलता नहीं ये दिल कुछ प्यार में बात ऐसी है लेकर इजाजत अब आपसे सांसें ये आती जाती है ढूंढे से मिलते नहीं है हम बस आप ही आप बाकी है पल भर ना दूरी सहे आपसे बेताबियां ये कुछ और है हम दूर होके भी पास है नजदीकियां ये कुछ और है देखा हजारों दफा आपको फिर बेकरारी कैसी है संभाले संभलता नहीं है दिल कुछ प्यार में बात ऐसी है की ऐसा सुकून और पाए कहाँ। आंखें हमेरा से आ गई, अब हम यहाँ से जाए कहाँ। देखा हजारों दफा आपको, फिर बेकरारी कैसी है। संभाले संभलता नहीं ये दिल, कुछ प्यार में बात ऐसी है। फिर बेकरारी कैसी है, कुछ प्यार में बात